how would you define an institution? Because a lot of people, even us, understand institutions in a way that it's not the same that you treat institutions in your research. Maybe it's a broader concept than we are used to. So what would be your definition?
Yeah, I think that the standard definition that's often given is that institutions are the rules of the game that determine how people interact economically, but maybe also in a variety of other ways. And right, there can be both formal institutions, which are or de jure institutions that are written down, that are legally binding, but also informal institutions, which in practice can oftentimes look a lot like culture, sort of the informal norms by which people interact, and they may not be rules that are written down, but they still govern behavior. And so I think institutions can be very, very broad. Yeah. Pretty much anything besides geography and maybe some aspects of beliefs, but it's a very broad umbrella.
Okay, yeah, in that regard, there are some authors that think that this institutional approach focuses a lot on colonial institutions and maybe to a lesser extent in more modern institutions. What do you think is the reason behind that, and do you agree in that special focus to older institutions?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of work on colonial institutions, maybe in part because you have a couple of really prominent papers, starting with Ajamoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, and then everybody got really excited because they were really cool papers and did a lot of work. But I think you're seeing more nowadays, and a lot of what I'm working on now about institutions after World War II. So thinking about the modern form of colonialism, right, which is maybe countries invading other countries to try to spread their ideas to them, not actually trying to conquer them and making them into colonies, but getting involved in conflicts. Like say the U.S. in Vietnam would be an example, or modern forms of foreign intervention, like foreign aid, all sorts of things that aren't colonialism, but they still involve powerful nations trying to influence outcomes.
Okay, and is the reason that you highlight this foreign influence because it's maybe a thing that is studied, or because you think this influences a powerful institution besides local institutions?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. First of all, just because of how many resources are spent on it. Like if you think about the U.S. Conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's well over $1 trillion. Over $1 trillion that the U.S. spent in Vietnam. It has a big impact on people's lives, and it's not something that there's been a lot of studies of. In part that's because, at least with the more recent things are, the harder it is to get data. Maybe it's still confidential or you need connections. But yeah, I think in terms of policy relevance, a huge amount of money is spent. It potentially has a big impact. But I think the more historical stuff is relevant as well. Just because something happened a long time ago and set certain paths in motion doesn't mean that things can't be changed if we understand sort of why colonialism had those persistent impacts.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because my next question is about Latin America and Peru in particular. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's regarded that it's very difficult to change institutions that have been around for a lot of years. How do you think the state in Peru could reshape institutions in order to increase the probability of economic development?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when you see institutional change, things will be very stagnant for a long time and then things change suddenly. Sort of the same thing with cultural change or with any type of sort of change. It can be a very nonlinear process and something that even policymakers don't have complete control of. But I think there's basic things like investments in infrastructure, investments in education. We have a lot of evidence that those things are useful, and that's part of the reason why certain regions of Peru are much poorer than others, is they lack sort of basic infrastructure, they lack high quality education, and those are sort of basic things. You don't have to change everything about society all at once to improve those. I mean, there may still be barriers to doing that, but I think it's a good place to start.
Okay. do you think any of the channels through which institutions impact development are more important to a developing country like Peru?
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard to say because this is always a hard part of doing analysis about channels. Is usually we have a good identification strategy to think about the overall effects.
Yeah.
But if you want to say how important each channel is, you would need a separate way to identify each of those channels, right? And there could be hundreds of them. So the mechanisms or the channels through which historical institutions affect things today, it's always a little bit more of guesswork, but I think you can combine your work with other studies, with the qualitative evidence, and try to understand what's going on. I think that probably varies from context to context.
Yes. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yes. You have previously published a paper in 2010 about the persistent effects, long-run effects of the MITA, and there you also find negative long-run effects in consumption and public provision. And I have two questions. Why did you choose consumption as a variable to measure welfare and not others like incomes, probability, likelihood of being poor, extremely poor, or indicators of health? And second, if you want in the future to focus your work in this field of institutions and long-run effects.
Yeah, so I think that the reason why development economists typically look at consumption and not income is because income tends to be very poorly measured in low-income settings. So it's, for example, very difficult to measure the income of a subsistence farmer because then you have to understand what prices to value the goods at, and that's very complicated. It's very difficult, and also oftentimes people work very irregularly, so they might do most of their work during one part of the year, and if that part of the year is not the part of the year that the survey references, or if it was a while ago and people have recall bias, whereas consumption especially for people close to subsistence, is relatively smoother over time. So in general, the measurement error will be less in consumption than it is in income. I looked at stunting of growth in children, data collected by the Ministry of Education, and that was like a really large sample. I think looking at health outcomes would be very interesting, and it's just I didn't have like comprehensive or extensive data on them. But I think that it's potentially important, and given like everything we know, it's probably quite correlated with income.
So in part it was due to the lack of a good data.
Yeah, exactly.
The issue with stunting and health. And the other question, would you like to focus your work in the future to this subject of institutions?
Yeah, so I'm mostly interested in long-run development and the reason why some regions grow more than others and how different factors influence that. So those factors could be like colonialism or foreign intervention, but it also could like be focused on specific types of policies that promote development, or how geography affects development. So there's a lot of potential explanations that I think are important to explore.
It was to